The letter arrived at Ronaldo's foundation office on a cold Monday morning in January, written in careful English by someone whose handwriting revealed both youth and determination. And when his assistant opened the envelope that bore a return address from a secondary school in Birmingham, she immediately understood that this was not typical fan mail, but something more urgent and painful. A cry for help from a 15-year-old Muslim student named Aisha, who was experiencing systematic bullying that had escalated beyond typical teenage cruelty to include threats, physical harassment, and social isolation that was destroying her academic performance and mental health. While school administrators seemed unable or unwilling to address discrimination that was affecting her ability to attend classes safely and participate in educational activities that should have been available to all students, regardless of their religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds. Aisha's letter described a pattern of harassment that had been building for months, beginning with verbal taunts about her hijab and Islamic faith that classmates treated as acceptable forms of humor despite their obvious cruelty and discriminatory nature, and escalating to physical intimidation that included having her headscarf pulled off in hallways, being pushed and shoved in ways that seemed designed to humiliate rather than simply harm, and facing social boycotts that left her eating lunch alone while former friends distanced themselves to avoid becoming targets of the same harassment that had made her a pariah in an educational environment where diversity was celebrated in theory but not protected in practice, when students from minority backgrounds faced peer persecution that teachers and administrators seemed incapable of stopping. The specific incidents that Aisha described revealed both the creativity and persistence of teenage cruelty when directed towards someone whose difference was visible and whose vulnerability was obvious to classmates who had learned to express prejudice through actions that could be dismissed as pranks or misunderstandings, rather than the systematic campaign of harassment that was clearly designed to make her feel unwelcome in spaces where she had every right to feel safe and supported while pursuing her education. And her detailed accounts of being called terrorist, having pork products placed in her bag, and facing whispered threats about what would happen to her family if they didn't leave England, revealed the sophistication of hatred that was being expressed by teenagers who had absorbed adult prejudices and were implementing them with the casual cruelty that characterized adolescent behavior when it was directed toward peers who were perceived as different or threatening to group cohesion that was maintained through exclusion rather than inclusion. The impact on Aisha's academic performance and mental health was evident throughout her letter, with descriptions of sleepless nights spent worrying about facing school the next day, declining grades that reflected her inability to concentrate on studies while constantly watching for potential threats from classmates who had made her daily life a source of anxiety and fear, and growing isolation from family members who were struggling to understand why their daughter was becoming withdrawn and depressed, despite their efforts to provide support and encouragement that could not address the fundamental problem of attending school, where her safety and dignity were not protected by adults who were supposed to ensure that all students could learn in environments free from harassment and discrimination. The failure of school officials to address Aisha's situation was particularly troubling, with her accounts of meetings with teachers and administrators who expressed sympathy but seemed incapable of implementing effective interventions that would stop the harassment while ensuring that perpetrators faced meaningful consequences for behavior that violated both school policies and basic principles of human decency. And her description of being told to ignore the bullying, to try harder to fit in, and to consider whether her religious practices might be contributing to the negative attention she was receiving, revealed the kind of victim blaming that characterized institutional responses to discrimination, when addressing the real problem would require confronting prejudices that were embedded in school culture and community attitudes, rather than simply managing individual incidents that were symptoms of broader problems. Ronaldo's response to Aisha's letter was immediate and comprehensive, beginning with a personal phone call that was arranged through the school's administration to ensure that she would be available to receive his support directly. rather than through intermediaries who might not convey the full strength of his commitment to helping her situation. And when they spoke for the first time, her surprise and gratitude at having her letter answered by someone whose global platform could bring attention to problems that had seemed impossible to solve through normal channels, revealed both her desperation and her hope that outside intervention might create changes that internal advocacy had failed to achieve, despite months of documentation and complaints that had generated sympathy but not solutions. The conversation that followed during their 30-minute phone call revealed Aisha's intelligence, resilience, and determination to continue her education despite circumstances that would have defeated many students who faced less systematic harassment, and her articulated description of how discrimination was affecting not just her immediate educational experience, but her future plans and career aspirations provided Ronaldo with clear understanding of how bullying could destroy potential and limit opportunities for talented young people whose contributions to society were being wasted through prejudice that prevented them from developing their abilities in supportive environments where diversity was genuinely valued rather than just theoretically celebrated. The letter that Ronaldo wrote in response was both personal and public, designed to provide direct support and encouragement to Aisha, while also serving as a broader statement about bullying, discrimination, and the responsibilities of adults to protect young people who were facing harassment based on their religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds. And his decision to make the letter public was motivated by understanding that individual solutions were insufficient when systematic problems required community-wide changes in attitudes and policies that would benefit not just Aisha, but other students who were facing similar challenges in schools, where diversity was not adequately protected through effective anti-bullying programs and administrative leadership that prioritized student safety over institutional convenience. The content of Ronaldo's letter addressed both the immediate crisis that Aisha was facing and the broader issues that her experience represented, with personal encouragement about her strength and potential, combined with clear statements about the unacceptability of religious discrimination in educational settings and the obligations of school officials to create safe learning environments for all students, regardless of their backgrounds. And his public sharing of the letter generated immediate media attention that brought scrutiny to the school's handling of discrimination complaints, while providing Aisha with visible support from someone whose advocacy could not be dismissed or ignored by administrators who had previously been able to avoid accountability for their failure to address systematic harassment. The impact of Ronaldo's intervention was both immediate and long-term, with school officials implementing new anti-bullying policies and training programs within weeks of the letter's publication. Several students who had been participating in the harassment facing disciplinary action that had been avoided when the problem was being handled privately, and Aisha experiencing a significant reduction in harassment as classmates realized that her situation was being monitored by people with influence and platforms who could bring negative attention to anyone who continued the discriminatory behavior that had previously been ignored or inadequately addressed by adults who should have been protecting all students equally. The foundation program that emerged from Aisha's case focused on supporting students who faced religious or cultural discrimination in educational settings, providing legal assistance for families who needed help advocating for their children's rights, resources for schools that wanted to improve their anti-bullying programs and diversity training, and direct support for students whose education was being disrupted by harassment that affected their academic performance and mental health in ways that could have lifelong consequences if not addressed through comprehensive interventions that addressed both immediate safety concerns and underlying prejudices that created hostile environments. The policy advocacy work that grew out of Aisha's situation included campaigns for stronger anti-discrimination protections in schools, better training for teachers and administrators about recognizing and addressing religious harassment, and clearer accountability measures for educational institutions that failed to protect students from discrimination that violated both legal requirements and moral obligations to provide safe learning environments for all children regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. And this advocacy work demonstrated how individual cases could catalyze broader policy changes that benefited entire communities of students who needed protection from discrimination that was often dismissed as normal teenage behavior rather than recognized as systematic harassment that required adult intervention and institutional reform. The educational impact of Ronaldo's letter included increased awareness among students about the harm caused by religious discrimination, better understanding among adults about the seriousness of bullying that targeted students' cultural or religious identities, and recognition that celebrity advocacy could play important roles in addressing discrimination that might otherwise remain hidden within institutional systems that were designed to avoid controversy rather than protect vulnerable students from harassment that affected their fundamental rights to education and personal safety that should have been guaranteed regardless of their religious beliefs or cultural practices. Years later, when Aisha had completed her education with honors and was pursuing university studies that would prepare her for a career in law, where she planned to advocate for students' rights and anti-discrimination policies, when the school's anti-bullying programs had become models for other institutions that were working to address religious and cultural harassment, when hundreds of other students had been helped through the Foundation's support programs for young people facing discrimination, Ronaldo would reflect that receiving Aisha's letter had reminded him that individual voices crying out for help deserved responses from people who had the power to create change. That educational discrimination was a serious problem that required sustained attention from advocates who could bring resources and influence to bear on institutional failures, and that sometimes the most important interventions were those that addressed the immediate needs of individual young people, while also creating systematic changes that would protect future generations of students from facing similar harassment and discrimination in educational environments where diversity should be celebrated and protected rather than tolerated, as long as it remained invisible and non-threatening to dominant cultural norms.